The village rested on the edge of the roaring sea, where the waves whispered secrets to those who listened. Among them was Diya, a young woman with eyes full of dreams and a heart full of kindness. She spent her mornings collecting seashells and her evenings listening to her grandfather's tales of the past. The village, though small, thrived on unity, and with the festival approaching, excitement buzzed in the air. Diya was engaged to Aman, a fisherman whose hands bore the strength of the tides. He was a man of few words but deep emotions, and his love for Diya was evident in the way he watched over her. Their bond was not one of grand gestures, but quiet understanding. Every evening, as the sun dipped into the ocean, Aman would bring her the freshest catch, a silent promise of his care. The village elders spoke of an approaching storm, but most dismissed it. The sky, painted in hues of orange and pink, seemed too serene to carry a warning. Yet, Diya sensed a change in the air. The wind, though gentle, carried an unfamiliar weight, as if whispering of something unseen. She tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on the upcoming festival. The villagers prepared with fervor. Stalls were set up, and lamps were polished until they gleamed like stars. Children ran through the streets, their laughter mingling with the sounds of drums and flutes. Diya, too, immersed herself in the preparations, helping the women weave garlands and arrange offerings. But deep within, an unsettling feeling lingered. One evening, as she stood by the shore, watching the waves rise and fall, Aman approached. "You seem lost in thought," he observed, his voice steady. She hesitated before speaking. "The sea feels different today, as if it's trying to tell us something." Aman glanced at the horizon. "The sea always speaks, Diya. We just have to decide whether to listen." His words should have comforted her, but they didn't. Instead, they fueled her worry. She turned back to the water, watching the way the waves stretched toward the shore, hungry, restless. That night, as the village danced under lantern-lit skies, an unfamiliar shadow arrived at its doorstep. A traveler, cloaked in mystery, seeking shelter from a storm that had yet to touch the land. His presence went unnoticed by most, lost in the laughter and music. But not by Diya. She saw him standing at the edge of the festivities, eyes scanning the village as if searching for something or someone. A flicker of recognition flashed in his gaze before it vanished. The storm had not yet arrived, but something told Diya it had already begun. The wind carried a sharp edge the next morning, stirring the ocean into restless waves. The sky, once calm, bore streaks of gray, hinting at the storm's silent approach. The village remained oblivious, busy with festival preparations. But Diya felt it, the shift in the air, the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. She couldn't shake the image of the stranger from her mind. His presence unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. Later that day, she found him near the temple steps, speaking with an elder. His clothes were travel-worn, his face shadowed by exhaustion, yet there was something familiar in his posture. Curiosity overpowered hesitation. She approached just as the elder nodded and walked away, leaving the man alone. He turned at her presence, meeting her gaze with a look that sent a shiver down her spine. "You were watching me last night," he said, his voice calm but unreadable. Diya held her ground. "You don't belong to this village." A hint of a smile played on his lips. "I used to." Before she could ask more, Aman's voice cut through the air. "Diya." She turned to see him striding toward them, his eyes locked onto the stranger. Aman was not an openly possessive man, but something in his stance warned of unease. The traveler nodded at Aman before walking away, disappearing into the narrow village paths. Diya turned to Aman, expecting questions, but he only watched the retreating figure with quiet suspicion. "Who is he?" she asked. Aman hesitated before answering. "Someone who shouldn't be here." That night, the winds grew stronger, rattling windows and howling through the trees. The festival continued, but there was tension in the air. Diya noticed how the elders whispered among themselves, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the temple, where the stranger had been given shelter. She caught fragments of their hushed words. "He shouldn't have returned. What if they find out? The storm is already here. Restlessness settled deep within her. Something was wrong, not just with the weather, but with the silence surrounding the traveler's identity. The first raindrop fell just as the celebrations reached their peak. A sudden gust of wind sent lanterns swinging wildly, their flames flickering. A murmur spread through the crowd. Then, without warning, the sky tore open, unleashing the full force of the storm. Thunder roared, drowning out screams as people scattered, rushing to secure their homes. The sea raged, waves crashing against the shore with violent hunger. Diya stood frozen, watching as the once calm village was swallowed by chaos. And in the distance, through the downpour, she saw him, the stranger, standing still, watching the storm with an expression that was not fear, but familiarity, as if he had been waiting for it all along. The storm unleashed its fury, tearing through the village with relentless force. Trees bent under the howling wind, roofs ripped away like paper, and the sea, once a gentle guardian, turned into a beast devouring everything in its path. Panic spread as people scrambled for shelter, their voices lost in the deafening roar of rain and thunder. Diya ran, her feet slipping on the flooded ground. The festival decorations lay in ruins, trampled and soaked. She searched for Aman, but all she saw were blurred figures fighting against the storm's wrath. A wave crashed over the shore, swallowing boats and dragging them into the abyss. The village was drowning. A sudden hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her to safety just as another gust of wind sent debris flying past. She turned, expecting Aman, but it was him, the stranger. His eyes burned with urgency. "Come with me," he shouted over the wind. She resisted. "I need to find Aman. You won't survive out here." His grip tightened, and before she could argue, he pulled her into an abandoned structure, shielding her from the chaos outside. Breathless, she pushed against his hold. "Why are you helping me?" For a moment, he hesitated, the storm raging around them. Then he spoke, his voice steady despite the madness outside. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything." She stared at him, realization dawning. You lived here before." He nodded. "Years ago, before they cast me out." Diya's mind spun. The whispers, the elder's fear, Aman's unease, it all made sense now. "Why were you banished?" He exhaled, his eyes dark with old wounds. "Because of a lie. I was accused of stealing from the village. They never gave me a chance to prove my innocence." The storm slammed against the walls, threatening to tear them apart. Diya's heart pounded, not just from fear but from the weight of his words. She had always believed in the fairness of her people, in the wisdom of the elders. But what if they had been wrong? A loud crash shattered the moment. The roof caved in, forcing them to dive for cover. The storm was relentless, determined to consume everything in its path. Then, through the chaos, a voice called her name. "Aman." Diya turned toward the sound, her heart leaping. Aman fought against the wind, his eyes wild with desperation. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Behind him, the sea surged forward in a monstrous wave. Without thinking, she ran. The stranger followed, but it was Aman who reached her first, pulling her into his arms just as the wave crashed down. The force knocked them off their feet, dragging them toward the merciless tide. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the stranger diving after them, his hand outstretched, refusing to let the past repeat itself. The world was a blur of water and darkness. Diya felt herself sinking, the weight of the storm pulling her under. Panic clawed at her chest, but just as the cold threatened to consume her, a strong hand grasped hers, yanking her upward. She gasped for air as she broke the surface, coughing and choking on the salt water. Aman was beside her, barely holding on, and the stranger was dragging them both toward the wreckage of a collapsed hut, the only thing keeping them from being swept away. The village was unrecognizable. What once stood as a place of warmth and laughter was now reduced to broken wood and flooded streets. Bodies moved in the distance, survivors searching for loved ones, clinging to whatever remained. The storm had passed, but its destruction was absolute. Aman coughed, regaining his breath. His eyes flickered between Diya and the stranger, realization setting in. He had saved them. The man Aman had doubted, the one he had mistrusted, had risked his life to pull them from death's grip. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Aman extended his hand. The stranger hesitated before clasping it. A silent truce formed in the wake of disaster. As dawn broke, the village gathered, assessing the damage. The festival that was meant to be a celebration of life now felt like a distant memory. People mourned their losses, yet in their grief, they found unity. The storm had taken much, but it had not broken them. The elders stood before the villagers, their faces lined with sorrow. And then, for the first time in years, they looked at the stranger. Not with anger, but with acknowledgement. His name, once spoken in whispers, was now called aloud. Raghav. Diya watched as the truth finally surfaced. The elders admitted their mistake, confessing that fear and haste had driven them to exile a man without proof. Raghav had returned, not for revenge, but for closure. The storm had forced them to confront the past, and now, with everything stripped away, there was only honesty left. Aman turned to Diya, his expression unreadable. "You knew, didn't you?" She nodded. "I felt it. He wasn't the enemy we thought he was." Aman exhaled, then looked at Raghav.
"Stay.
"If you want to." Raghav met his gaze, then glanced at the village, the only home he had ever known. Slowly he nodded. The festival, though ruined, was not forgotten. That night, as the village lit small clay lamps, their flames flickered against the remnants of destruction. Diya watched as the lights swayed in the breeze, fragile yet unbroken. Aman stood beside her, his fingers intertwining with hers. And in the distance, Raghav placed a single Diya on the water, watching as it drifted away, a symbol of the past, of loss, and of new beginnings. The storm had passed, but its lessons would remain forever.